this is an example or another example of Russia not playing by the rules.
Richard Miles says Moscow has some explaining to do after a Russian warplane hit a US drone over the Black Sea. The federal and South Australian governments signed an agreement to support the construction of nuclear-powered submarines in Adelaide. New South Wales Labor to consider introducing phone jammers to enforce a ban in schools if elected next weekend. And the AFL set to return for season 2023 with a blockbuster game at the MCG. Very good evening to you. The Defence Minister says Russia has explaining to do after a United States drone was hit and reportedly down. It's believed 2 Russian jets attempted to intercept the drone before dumping fuel on it. They then flew in front and stuck its propeller, causing it to crash into the Black Sea. Richard Miles says it's another example of Moscow not playing by the rules and has called on them to explain themselves. The Pentagon described what happened as reckless and unprofessional. The federal government and SA government have today signed an agreement that outlines their commitments to supporting the construction of nuclear-powered submarines in Adelaide. They've agreed to work together to invest research capability and infrastructure to generate a workforce close to the submarine construction yard at Osborne. The SA government says they are determined to seize the opportunity, while Foreign Minister Penny Wong described it as a genuine partnership between the two governments, and they are working together to ensure we develop our workforce. The government says the project will deliver jobs and benefit South Australia's economy for generations to come. New South Wales Labor is considering introducing phone jammers to prevent students from using mobile phones in school if elected next Saturday. The party announced several months ago they would ban mobile phones in government schools if elected, following similar moves interstate. Opposition leader Chris Minns says they're looking at emerging technology when it comes to combating mobile phones in schools. Phone jammers are already used in some prisons. And anticipation is building ahead of the AFL season opener tomorrow night. Richmond will take on the Navy Blues in the opening tradition before a Friday night blockbuster featuring reigning premiers Geelong. Alistair Clarkson, Ross Lyon and Brad Scott will return to senior AFL coaching roles in their new respective clubs in North Melbourne, St Kilda and Essendon amid the many other key round 1 matchups throughout the weekend. The home of football, the MCG, will be host of all 4 primetime games in the first round of season 2023. Returning to the New South Wales state election, and independence could be crucial in determining who forms the next government in an event no party reaches a majority. All independent MPs who were elected in 2019 are expected to be returned, while several MPs who left party in recent years also have a chance of election. Teal independents are also targeting several seats following success at the federal election. 6 News spoke to Karen Freyer, who is running in the Liberal Health seat of Vaucluse.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to discuss why I think that this election is so important. I just want to start the conversation talking about why this election is really important. A lot of people have really focused on the federal elections, but I think that we realised during COVID how much power the state government has over our lives. So I think that this election is equally as important. When I talk to people on the street, people are genuinely frustrated with living in a safe seat. Vaucluse, the electorate that I'm running in, has always been Liberal. And a lot of people feel that because it's always been Liberal, we've been taken for granted. And there are a number of issues here that people have been concerned about for many, many years. We desperately need a second public high school. We have one public high school that services 11 primary public schools. People are also scared not scared, but they're also concerned about the lack of integrity. Everybody's heard about jobs for mates, but equally disconcerting was the Auditor General's report, which recently came out and said that this government awarded bushfire grants upon who you voted for. And then finally, a lot of people are very disconcerted about the amount of development that is being approved in our area, and that it's development that isn't supported by the necessary infrastructure.
Yeah, I'll get onto that in a second. Just on one thing, which is a bit of a unique element that New South Wales lower house elections have. We, of course, or you, of course, I'm in Victoria, have optional preferential voting. And that's really interesting when it comes to a minor party or an independent like yourself trying to get in. Are you worried that might harm you if not enough people who may vote for a major party or the Greens or something like that go ahead and preference you, especially when so often there's just the just vote one message that seems to be hammered by certain parties and certain people?
Look, I've been really fortunate. I've got second preferences from the Greens, from Labor, and from the Animal Justice Party. And we know from experience that the Green voters are very, very good at understanding preferences. And I know that the Labor team are really going to be pushing for people to make sure that they number their preferences, as are the Animal Justice Party as well. So, look, you're 100% correct that that is an issue at a state level. But we're doing everything we can to try to mitigate that problem.
So you spoke about development just before and infrastructure needs. I think you said, not in this interview, but you've said before that residents in the electorate are concerned about, I think it was the 500 apartments the government is planning on building. We are in the middle of a housing crisis right around the nation. What's the issue with more apartments?
I'm really glad that you brought that up. So the development lobby, which is Urban Task Force, tell us again and again and again that we need to increase supply, right? And I think that argument needs to be a little bit more nuanced than what they're describing. What we're finding here in the electorate that I'm wanting to represent is that what is being developed is not the sort of housing that my children would be able to afford. It's not the type of housing that our teachers would be able to afford. Our key workers, our healthcare workers, our early child educators would be able to afford. It's 3-bedroom apartments with underground parking. And what I spoke with the head of planning for the local council here, and what she said to me, I said to her, look, if you could change one thing, what would it be? And she said to me, we have a general frustration where we're finding a lot of developers now are buying the older apartment blocks that contain the 1-bedroom apartments and the studios, and they're developing them into 3-bedroom apartments with underground parking. So what we need to do is I think we need to tackle it both ways. I think we need to address the diversity of housing stock, right? And ensure that there are incentives in place to ensure that the sort of housing that young people and key workers can buy are being produced, because right now there is an incentive for them to be produced. But also too, there's a general frustration too with a lack of infrastructure. I mentioned right at the top of this interview that we desperately need a second public high school, right? So I think what we find when it comes to the state government is they legislate density targets, but they don't legislate infrastructure targets. We need the support. We need the infrastructure to support that density, and we need to ensure the density that is allowed is diverse enough that everyone can afford to live here. Because I don't want Vaucluse to be an enclave just for 3-bedroom apartments with underground parking. We need to make it a place for everybody. And, affordable housing is something that really has not been addressed in Vaucluse. If you look at the planning document for Woollahra Council, affordable housing is merely an aspirational target, right? It's absolutely nothing. And affordable housing doesn't just make sense from an ethical perspective, it makes good economical sense as well, because I've been speaking to a lot of small business owners here and retailers, and they're really struggling to find workers. But workers need to be able to afford to live here. And unfortunately, the incentives aren't in place to encourage the type of development that allows everyone to live in this electorate.
I think the other thing you said there when you came out and initially spoke about those 500 apartments, that the government wants to build, is that it's going to be, or it is going to be impossible to kind of drive around the area. You said that while at a train station. I mean, why not just use a train or walk?
No, I don't. Are you familiar with Vaucluse?
I live in Melbourne, but I'm pretty sure it was a train station.
So I'm really glad that you brought that up. So we have 2 arterial roads here in New South Wales, in the electorate of Vaucluse, New South Head Road and Old South Head Road, and we're on the coast. So there isn't the opportunity. We've only got really 2 train stations. We've got 1 train station in the electorate, right? And the only other way to get around in the electorate is either by car or by bus. So
Can you walk?
it's quite a large electorate. I don't know if you're familiar. I would really encourage you to come and have a look at Vaucluse. What we found is that density has increased, but they've actually cut back on the bus services. Now, we've got severe congestion issues on our 2 artillery roads. So especially when school's in. So on one of the roads, which is New South Head Road, we have we have 4 schools going straight up that road. And whenever school is in, it's impossible to drive down those roads. And that's because we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the buses, and we don't have the public transportation to move people around. So people have to drive everywhere. So while I can, I think, obviously people just can take a cheap shot and go, well, you're outside a train station. That's the only train station in the electorate. And once you're there, you have to drive around, you have to be on the road. So look, it's really easy to take a cheap shot, but I would encourage people to actually understand the electorate of Vaucluse. And there's one train station, and the other times you have to get around in a car, or you have to get into a bus that doesn't really exist.
I think the other big issue happening at this, and it seems to be a statewide issue in New South Wales, is, of course, pokies reform. We've been hearing about it for months. Now, you have said that you are in favour of a mandatory cashless gaming card. In the event of a minority government, which, seems very possible, will that issue, assuming you are elected, be a must for any government if they were to get your support, as other independents have come out and said, that is a must?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think neither party has addressed pokies sufficiently enough. So Tim Costello, who I would basically see as sort of a beacon when it comes to pokey reform, has described Labor's policy as being written in the back room of Clubs New South Wales. And when it comes to Perrottet and the Liberals, look, I really applaud Dominic Perrottet for having the courage to speak about this, because we've had many, many years that have passed and no one has had the courage to do it. My only problem with what the Liberals are proposing, first of all, I don't think it's quick enough. I think we need to do it in the next term. I think 5 years is too long. And I think there's another interesting fact that no one's really pointed out so far. If you look at the forward estimates of the budget that Matt Keane released, what you'll find is there is a significant amount of revenue that they've identified coming from the pokies. And not only does that revenue exist, but it also increases over the next 4 years. And this government has not identified how it is, what it's going to do to replace that money. So if they're really serious about, taking control of the pokies, they need to tell us how they're going to deal with that line of revenue that isn't going to exist anymore.
Karen Freya there. A reminder of the top stories we're following this hour, and Defence Minister Richard Marles says Russia has some explaining to do after a United States drone was hit and reportedly downed. It's believed 2 Russian jets attempted to intercept the drone before dumping fuel on it, then flew in front of it and stuck its propeller, causing it to crash into the Black Sea. And the federal government and SA governments have today signed an agreement that outlines their commitments to supporting the construction of nuclear-powered submarines in Adelaide. Foreign Minister Penny Wong described it as a genuine partnership between the two governments, and they are working together to ensure we develop our workforce. And that is 6 News for this hour. There's more news on our website 24/7, that is SIXNewsAU.com, and on social media just search 6 News to find us. More news coverage continues right after this, but for now though, I'm Austin Pollock. Thank you so much for your company. Have a great night.
Hello, I'm Roman McKinnon. You're watching Uncensored right here on 6 News. The Queensland election isn't until October 2024, but the issues that will likely swing votes are already making headlines. The Labor government has introduced new laws in the hopes of tackling youth crime, admitting that some of what they have announced is incompatible with human rights. But even with Anastasia Palaszczuk facing criticism, winning the next election may not be easy for LNP leader David Crisafulli. His party has only ever won a single general election, and Labor has been in power since the 1990s almost continuously. Six News spoke to the state opposition leader about all that and more. David Crisafulli, welcome to Six News.
Thanks for having me, Ron.
The Premier says this is above politics and about putting community safety first. If you were in government right now, what would you do to tackle this youth crime wave?
Consequences for action, unshackle the judiciary, but above all, get serious about gold standard early intervention. And I think at the moment we're failing across all those platforms. Now, it's one thing to say that something's above politics, but in the end, the solutions that the community have been putting forward, and we've been doing them on their behalf, has fallen on deaf ears for the better part of 2 years. And it's only once it became a political issue and innocent people lost their lives that the government suddenly found this interest in doing yet another point plan to try and deal with it. But we're missing, the heart of the issue lies that we're failing kids at both ends of the Youth Justice Act. We're failing them early on when we've got to get in and give them help, give them hope, give them employment and education and help them turn their life around. We're failing at that end, but we're also failing them at the other end, which is when you've got those hardcore repeat offenders who are just ripping the guts out of community. And, you know, the Youth Justice Act was watered down 8 years ago. So you've had 8 years of a pipeline of these offenders and their behaviours getting more brazen. And they're the ones that we needed to deal with 8 years ago. So I take the approach of let's get in gold standard early intervention, let's turn kids around and let's make them productive members of society.
Police Minister Mark Ryan said that last week that the new breach of bail offence is incompatible with human rights and that the state's Human Rights Act will be overridden in the process. Do you support this decision to override a Human Rights Act?
We've been pushing for breach of bail for a long time because we do believe in consequences for action. But the great breach that's happening at the moment is the failure at the front end to turn kids around. So, look, I'll never walk away from making sure that there are consequences for action, and I want to make sure that the hardcore people get punished for their bad behaviour. But the greatest human rights violation is not turning a kid around early on when you've got a chance. The greatest violation is the fact that many of these kids are known to child safety, and yet we haven't done anything about it. That's the real violation. So, look, I'm not someone who walks both sides of the street, and I'm up front. If someone has a knife and they're going into someone's house and they're using that weapon, hey, you've got to have consequences for that bad behaviour. That's just a non-negotiable. But at the other end of the spectrum, you can't just say that you turn your back on a generation of kids, and you can't say that someone makes a mistake and you lock them up and throw away the key. That's never been my style. You know, people deserve a second chance, but that comes with real, genuinely trying to turn kids around. And one of the things that we've done, Roman, is we've written to the Auditor General and asked for a proper review of everything we're doing. And let's have a look at what's working and what's not and what we can do better. Because if we can turn kids around, that makes a better society. And in the long run, it's better for everyone. It's better for the budget. It's better for the community. I don't believe in not trying to turn kids around early, because, you know, if you give someone aspiration and you show them a way, you can turn people around from a life, what will otherwise be a lifetime of crime.
You announced 3 proposed legislation changes, including an early intervention plan, changes to the Bail Act, and not having detention as a last resort. How different are these to the Palaszczuk government's plan?
Well, they're about consequences for action, but they're also about getting in early and turning people around. And you mentioned one of them, and that's removing detention as a last resort. I see that as unshackling the judiciary and allowing them to do their job. And if a magistrate believes that a young person does need a custodial sentence, well, that gives them the freedom to do it. If they believe they can send them off to an early intervention program, well, that gives them the freedom to do that as well. And if we can get gold standard early intervention, that will help turn things around. The problem for the government is they consistently see this as a political issue rather than a law and order issue, and rather than a youth justice issue. And you only have to look at the history of this. The decision to water down the Act early on But then all of the piecemeal changes that have happened throughout, it just paints the tale of a government that's just chaotic in its behaviour. And you'll never turn around a system if you don't have that real attention to detail. And every time I read the reports that exist in this space, and there's been many, there's a common theme. It's an announcement, and somehow the government think that let's make an announcement and then everything's hunky-dory. Well, it doesn't work like that. You've got to plan it, then you've got to deliver it, then you've got to go back and evaluate it and see what's working and what's not. And there just isn't that attention to detail at the moment. And we're failing a generation of kids, and we are failing a generation of Queenslanders as well.
Well, we can expect this issue of crime to be a big topic at next year's state election. Just on that, why do you think that it is that the LNP and its predecessors have only won a single state election since 1989?
We need to get back to doing what Queenslanders demand of us, and that is talking about them and the issues that matter to them. And look, don't get me wrong, we're up against a formidable political machine. The Labor Party in Queensland is a formidable political machine, and the Premier is a formidable politician. So I'm certainly not taking anything for granted. And what I can say, though, and even my harshest critics will acknowledge, that I made a commitment a couple of years ago that I would reform the LNP, and reform we have. And we've been united, we've been disciplined, we're hungry to win, we're hungry to serve, and people are seeing that we're credibly putting forward policies from opposition that the government's adopting, and we are highlighting not just the issues, and those issues are many at the moment, the economy, and we've seen some hugely mixed messages, particularly around tax and reform. Service delivery, we've spoken about one, which is law and order, but don't get me started on housing. We have not partnered with local government to deliver infrastructure to allow young people to get in and buy their first home, to make it affordable for someone to rent. We haven't delivered social housing at the standard that we should and the level that we should. We haven't partnered with the community housing, and that's created a feeding frenzy for people trying to get into the property market. And on health, our ambulance ramping is the worst in the country. So on the service delivery front, we've failed, and I've highlighted that, but also put forward our solutions. And then on integrity, many of your viewers will have seen me speak many times about the integrity crisis in Queensland, and I want to run a government that people can be proud of. So we have reformed the party, and that's given us clear air to talk about ourselves and to talk to Queenslanders about the reform that we've done and the issues that matter to them. And the state government in recent times has proven to be quite chaotic, and the internal factions are starting to tear them apart. But to come back to where I started, Ronan, I'm under no illusions how big this task is. We need to win 14 seats in Queensland. That is a very, very big mountain. But we're hungry to serve, mate.
Do you think it's possible that the merger of the Liberals and Nationals just hasn't worked at a state level because it's only led to a single win that was ended pretty soon after?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it is the right model, and I think it can do what no other entity can, and that is unite the city and the country. And I know from myself, I was born in regional Queensland, and mum and dad are still on the farm. They still love it. I live on the Gold Coast, and I understand the southeast. So I'd like to think that, having lived and worked in regional Queensland and in metropolitan Queensland, I can understand the issues that matter to all Queenslanders. But in the end, the things that I get asked from the butcher in Boulia or the baker in Brisbane, mate, if you boil it down, it's all the same thing. They just want the government to get out of their life, to have consistency when it comes to economic policy. They want to know if they pick up the phone that an AMBO will turn up to look after their kids, that there's an education system that enables their children to be able to get ahead, that we have world-class national parks that are managed well and we're serious about protected areas. They want to know that the government cares about them and not the internal ramifications of the government. It's all, in the end, the things that unite the city and the country. I do believe the LNP is the vehicle to do it, and we've sorted out ourselves. We are united, we are focused, and this government's been in power for 3 terms or 10 years at the next election. And one of your previous guests is the current Prime Minister, Mr. Albanese. And one of the things he said in the lead up to the last election, which I remember well, was governments don't get better in their 4th term. And I reckon he's right.
And on the matter of Parliament and, as you say, holding the government to account, do you support bringing back an upper house in Queensland?
What I want to do in the meantime, and I know there's a lot of debate on that, and debate that, you know, from both sides. Some people say the last thing we need is more politicians. Other people say we need scrutiny, and Queensland is an anomaly in that area. I'll tell you what I do support in the meantime, and that is to get our committee systems to work the way that they should. At the moment, the committees, in many cases, don't provide the robust checks and balances they should. And the estimates process, which every year is the one vehicle that the opposition has to probe and scrutinise the budget, it's turned into an absolute farce. And the way that Labor chairs run a protection racket for Labor ministers is wrong. And I've already said the way that I intend to reform that. I want that process chaired independently. So the Speaker or the Deputy Speaker or crossbench or whatever format it is, I want an end to hours upon hours of Dorothy Dixon nonsensical questions. I want genuine analysis. I want scrutiny. I want that process to work. So that'll be first cab of business if we're given the good fortune of winning and serving the people at the end of next year. But I know there's mixed views on an upper house. But in the meantime, let's get the system we've got working a heck of a lot better than what it is now.
Just finally, last year you made a TikTok that was watched over 3.5 million times, outlining the difference that learner drivers had to pay for their license. The cost was eventually slashed. Do you take any credit for that? And how do you and do you believe social media, especially TikTok, is important for political messaging?
It wasn't my win, mate. It was a win for young Queenslanders, and that came by a young person who had just paid the exorbitant fee of $186, and they went to their local member of parliament. They said, this is absolutely crazy. We had a look at it, and then we ran what I think was a pretty good campaign, but it was only a good campaign because of that, because of people power. And you're right, 3.5 million views, and the government were, quite frankly, forced into acting. Now, every young learner who goes to get their licence can put another $110 in their pocket. And mate, that makes me smile. That means something. And I've spoken to young people about the difference that means to them. That's the difference between being able to connect with mates. That's the difference between getting that licence, because many people had to work weeks to be able to save that. I spoke with young Queenslanders who said they would put that towards another driving lesson, which and as you know, that's worth 3 hours for every one. So that fast track getting it, it's life-changing. And I love that. On social media, it's a natural part of modern politics. I have 2 teenage daughters. They find it completely and utterly embarrassing when I turn up on their Friends For You page, but that's just the way it is. I promise them I won't dance. I don't, but I, do a bit of cooking and a bit of fun. In terms of the power of new age media, I can tell you, mate, the moment this request came through, I said to my guys, we are doing this interview. Long time viewer, first time on the show, but you can call me anytime. I like engaging with young people, and I might be getting towards that old dinosaur age, but I still understand that ultimately young people have a big say on the future, and I'm keen to get more young people in the parliament. And we had a chance about a year ago with a by-election, and we elected the youngest member of the Queensland Parliament, a young fellow called Bryson Head, in a by-election. And young man in his 20s, he is the youngest member of the parliament, and he's a member of the LNP. And that's what reform looks like. And I can't wait to bring more young people into the parliament, more women, more people from different cultural backgrounds, more people from small business. And that's what I intend to do at the election next year.
David Crisafulli, thanks so much for your time. Queensland Opposition Leader and LNP Leader David Crisafulli there. A reminder that for the latest headlines and breaking news 24/7, as well as more editions of Uncensored, head to our website SIXNewsAU.com or follow us on social media. Just search 6NewsAU to find us. I'm Roman McKinnon. Thanks for tuning in.
When big news breaks.
It pains me to announce that I have no option but to resign from the office of Premier.
Reimpose stage 3 stay-at-home restrictions effective from midnight tomorrow night.
6 News is there for you.
This was a scene of what some are describing as almost